Hello, everyone. I am Matt Landis, and you are listening to the Tink Club podcast. I think we all understand that humans are naturally curious creatures, so it only makes sense that we have a yearning to explore our own consciousness. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to the psychedelic pioneers of the last century, whose works have given us the tools we need to search the inner frontier. There's a Greek proverb that I'm sure you have heard before that goes, "A society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they know they shall never sit." Although it's sad that we no longer have Sasha Shogun or Albert Hoffman to make new tools for us, the scope of their contributions is so immense that their legacy will likely live forever. Our guest this week is one of those psychedelic pioneers, Dr. James Fadiman. Dr. Fadiman is the father of modern psychedelic therapy and the author of the Psychedelic Explorers Guide. Published in 2011, the guide is the culmination of 4 decades of research and analysis, along with anecdotes, insights, and hope for the future of entheogens. I believe that it is a harbinger of serious change, that after years of prohibition, it is one of the first flowers to peek through the concrete and show the others that it is time to take a huge leap forward. Go to psychedelicexplorersguide.com or find a copy on Amazon if you don't already own one. We'll also have links on our website. This might be one of the most important books you will ever own, even if you never plan on using entheogens. We have the tools. Now we have to learn to use them properly. Just a few quick things before we get started. This episode is brought to you by the Instagram account, To Higher Consciousness. This is one of my absolute favorite accounts to follow, honestly. When you talk about creating your own reality, it's important to make that reality a positive and impactful one. Social media has become such an ingrained and integral aspect of life to most people in the West that we forget how much the things we see and read every day can affect us, even subconsciously. If you follow To Higher Consciousness on Instagram, your social media experience will be spiced with knowledge and positive energy. Do yourself and your reality a huge cosmic favor and check it out. I know it seems somewhat insignificant now, but by doing something as simple as following To Higher Consciousness on Instagram, you're helping this podcast, you're helping yourself, and you're making the world a better place. That's all one word, To Higher Consciousness. You can also go to tinktinkclub.com and check out the club section for more ways to show your support. Now, strap yourself in as we blast off to explore the frontier of inner space with Dr. James Fadiman. Welcome back to the Tink Club. I am Matt Landis.
I'm Tim King.
And I'm Chris Conti.
And joining us today is a very special guest. Since the 1960s, he has been studying and working intimately with psychedelics as medicine and is the pioneer of modern psychedelic therapy. He's also the author of the Psychedelic Explorers Guide, which is perhaps one of the most integral and important books that has been written in the past century. His research and thorough experimentation over decades has helped millions of people and will continue to ripple for generations to come. He is here to help us water and nourish the already sprouting seeds of the psychedelic renaissance, Dr. James Fadiman.
What a nice introduction. Hi.
Could you just tell us what led you to writing a Psychedelic Explorers Guide?
Well, it's a little embarrassing, but that's what podcasts are for. I had been advised by people in my family who are literary that I should write a memoir about this era. And I spent about a summer trying to figure out all the interesting things that had happened to me and reading up on the books that I should have read then and so forth. So I actually knew my own era. And then I thought, who cares about me? And the answer was such a tiny list. And then I had a different thought, which is, what do I know that other people either don't know or have forgotten? And that led to a much more, I think, useful book, which was the Psychedelic Explorers Guide.
Did you consider it like a manual of sorts? Like, did you write it as to make it a manual for people to read?
No, it's got a manual in it, which is a few chapters on how to best use these materials kind of most safely and most profoundly. And it has a number of stories, a few of mine, more interesting of other people. It has some research that isn't available elsewhere, mainly the long sections on how to use these substances for hard science creative problems. Mm-hmm. And also, it's probably the first publication on microdosing. So it's a little bit of a grab bag, and when I was putting it together, I was fairly sure that the publisher would not be interested, which meant I could really do it any way I wished. And then the publisher said, hey, I like what you're doing.
I wanted to get into the real heart of what set and setting actually is and what the most ideal circumstance would be. Can we start with set and what that actually is, the definition of set?
Yeah, well, set and setting, this kind of buzzword, really means what's your intention or your attitude or your mental state. And setting is literally the kind of physical, emotional environment. So originally psychedelics were assumed to be like other little pills, and therefore they were given to people in a sterile hospital setting with nobody paying much attention to them. And that turned out to make people feel very uncomfortable, alone, unloved, paranoid. And therefore the original researchers thought, aha, the effects of the drug are all those things. And only when a safe, secure, comfortable setting like your own living room was developed, did people begin to see that these substances actually simply open your mind in many different ways, and that the set and setting turns out to be critical, so that if you're looking for kind of personal insight, that's more likely that's what you're going to get. If you're looking to understand how you and divinity are related, you're more likely to get that, and so forth. So the reason for those two chapters is really to help people who are not going to be able to find professionals to help them, because the United States law says you really aren't allowed to help people yet.
Yeah.
But people keep helping each other. And what people tend to forget is that since psychedelics became illegal, 25 million people have taken, in the U.S. only, have taken LSD only.
Who admitted it.
So we're talking about a big group of people, and what I've gotten over the years since the book came out is a lot of people have said, gee, thank you. I never thought of it except as something that I would take and then go to a concert.
Right. So you wanted people to understand that, these are tools.
Well, they're tools, and they're also very powerful tools.
Right.
And someone says, well, is it okay to go to a concert? And I said, well, it's okay, but it's also okay to take a microscope and use it as a doorstop.
Right.
It's really lovely for a doorstop. It's heavy, it's got a good handle, but that's not the best possible use.
Right. Do you think using psychedelics is key to leading a fulfilling spiritual life?
Well, what we know is that every culture that had access to psychedelic plants used them. And they tended to use them in a sacred setting with the intention of becoming more aware of their relationship to each other, to nature, and to that which holds nature together. So they have a particular power to improve your awareness of your own spiritual nature and your relationship to everything else.
Right. See, I have a couple Christian friends that I not try to convince to take, but I try to open their mind about psychedelics a bit. And I think if they took it, it would be like they're playing with a full deck of cards.
Well, when what you find in any religious group that says, well, I don't know about this substance because my belief system is such and such. And the answer is, well, belief is, this is a Christian term, is we kind of believe in things unknown, which is, you have the faintest idea what you're talking about. That's what belief means.
Right.
There's a higher realm called knowledge, and there's still a higher realm, and this is actually a term from the Islamic world, it's called certainty. And what happens with psychedelics is you tend to see the core of your own tradition rather than the details. Right. So there's some wonderful powerful Christians who use psychedelics, and they're still wonderful, powerful Christians. And there's other people that have said, gee, what I was taught when I was 12 in Sunday school really is quite immature and restricted, and there is a much larger world out there. So when you say to your Christian friends, would you like to know more about the divinity that you feel strongly about? Probably they'd say, well, yeah.
Right, of course. Have you personally, with the experiments over the years, have you seen a divine connection? Have you heard stories or any profound visions from people you've talked to?
Well, when we were operating before LSD was illegal, and we were operating a little clinic in Menlo Park, and our goal was to help people who had what we called then the psychedelic experience. Now we call it entheogenic, meaning definitely spiritual. And what we found is when people would be able to transcend their own personality, when you begin to see that you are more than, that I'm much more than Jim Fadiman. Jim Fadiman is a nice guy, but there's more to me than that. And that particular shift turns out to be quite fundamental in making, for many people, their lives work better. So we were aiding people to have what could be called a classical mystical experience. And a classical mystical experience is when you are aware of the interrelated unity of all things. And that's kind of grandiose when you hear it just as words. But if you think in kind of common sense terms, like right now, I have something to my ear, so I'm connected to that bit of metal and plastic. But my body is resting in a chair, which is resting on the floor. It's really connecting to the floor, and the whole floor is connected to the frame of the house, and the house to the earth, etc., etc., etc. So we are connected. It's very hard to imagine yourself not being connected.
That's right. I've always thought of the psychedelic experience as like a physiological reset, sort of like a cosmic sigh. But I think that it mostly has to do with the integration period afterwards. Like, can you talk about that?
This is unfortunately what's missing in most of people's experience, which is how do you really integrate what you have experienced, particularly if what you've experienced seems to be quite different from what you were taught. A parallel is something we call culture shock, which is if I get in a plane and I get out of the plane and I'm in India and I am overwhelmed with the amount of people, the noise, the color, the fact that the food, most of it is I don't know what it is, and a lot of it is very hot and not my tasting, and the language is different. There's something called culture shock.
Right.
And it takes a while, as people say, it takes a while to adjust to being in India. But people understand that, and we have a term for it, and so forth. But with psychedelics, there's a tendency to not really know much about how to integrate an experience, and it is a problem.
Another question I really was wondering is why LSD? I know you explained in the book briefly, but you seem to like.
Why do I prefer to write about LSD?
Yeah, you've called it the Babe Ruth of therapies.
Did I say that? Yeah. Oh my God, I should watch out for myself.
But why LSD as opposed to psilocybin?
Well, I happen to have worked with LSD more than anything else. Mm-hmm. So that's in a very simple way. And when I started this book, I thought, this book is going to be different than my other books. I'm going to limit it to what I actually know something about. So it is mainly LSD. I worked with mescaline. I've done some work with psilocybin. I've not worked with ayahuasca directly. So it's, in a sense, it's not really a psychedelic explorer's guide as much as it's a psychedelic explorer's guide of what are now known these days as classic psychedelics.
Right.
Because mescaline, peyote, mushrooms, psilocybin, LSD, morning glory seeds all work about the same in terms of human beings. They have somewhat different chemistries. and they last different amounts of time, but they seem to be in the same realm.
Right.
Do you know any studies that are going on using LSD that other psychedelics aren't being covered or working on now? Recently, we spoke with Brad Burge, and he was mentioning that they might start using psilocybin to treat, I believe it was Asperger's.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a number of studies going on with people like to work with psilocybin for two reasons. One is they don't have to deal with people saying, "Oh, LSD, I heard about that." Someone said psilocybin's great saving graces is hard to spell. The other very serious part of that is psilocybin lasts 5 to 8 hours, LSD lasts 8 to 12. And if you're running research, literally, people can go home at night, having put in a 9 to 5 day.
Right.
And with LSD, it's longer days. And that's those are two real reasons, which is it was easier to get government permission to work with psilocybin. So that's part of it. MAPS is also doing with MDMA, and a great deal of research with that. And that's really, it's not a true psychedelic. It's an impact, and it's much for emotional work. Now,
what I don't hear much about is psilocybin and cluster headaches, and I've seen marvelous results just from a simple YouTube or Google search. Do you know if there's anything being done with that?
Yeah, there is a research study that Yale is going to start, I hope, as soon as possible, but they're very aware that psilocybin, that all the classics that I mentioned, can help cluster headache sufferers, and almost nothing else can.
Right.
And any of the classic psychedelics has the same effect on cluster headaches, which is mainly they stop them. They don't alleviate them, meaning it doesn't hurt less. They go away. And it's quite extraordinary. And there is a group, which is very, very easy to get to on the web. It's called Cluster Busters. And they are devoted to helping each other make use of these substances, illegal or not, to help themselves. And I've recently gotten some notes from people in England and in Italy who also are using psychedelics for clusters successfully. So it's an area where it is the obvious treatment of choice, and there's no research yet. But there are hundreds, maybe thousands of people who are doing it and using it. So there's two kinds of research. One is what you do in a laboratory and double blinds and so forth. The other is really called field research, which is what's out there that people are already doing that's working.
Do you know how long from ingestion to clearing the headache is?
It ranges from 10 seconds to the better part of a day.
Okay.
That's one of the things that I'm actually looking at, and I am asking the group of cluster sufferers who not sufferers anymore, but who are using these things, is how much they use, when do they take it, and how effective is it. Right. So there's a wide range of reactions.
Is it a pill form or is it intravenous? What is the ideal?
Well, I watched a little bit of video that the BBC did. It was about a guy in Texas who grows his own mushrooms, and he dries them and puts them in capsules, and that's the way he takes them. Oh.
So it's more I'm sorry.
Yeah, and so and that is one of the ways that people are doing it, is literally learning how to grow their own medication.
That's right. We spoke to Dennis McKenna a few weeks ago, and that was his suggestion, grow your own.
Well, on this site, there's a discussion of how to make it into a tea, and basically there's a site that people are trying to help each other.
That's great.
And it's a shame that the government hasn't yet moved to do research in this area, but hopefully if the Yale study happens, that will open the door, because there's different rules for substances when they seem to be the only thing that helps.
Right.
And also, of course, cluster headaches are hardly an American problem.
Right.
Every country has them, and so it's one of the areas that I'm currently involved in, and I have such compassion and such amazement. These are the most courageous people I have ever met by far.
They go through so much pain from watching them. I mean, it's really incredible what these people go through, punching their heads and wincing and screaming in pain. And, you know, people aren't really talking about cluster headaches right now. It's PTSD and addiction, anxiety.
Well, cluster headaches are they're not as rare as I wish they were, but they are rare. And one of the things that I've asked the cluster people is how many, because they began to say it was a long time before it was diagnosed, so I'm asking, how many years was it before you were diagnosed correctly? It ranges from like 1 to 20.
Wow.
And then how many other medications have you tried? And it ranges from about 8 or 10 to 80. So these are people who have not been diagnosed correctly, have not been treated correctly, and the few things that work don't work all that well.
Right.
They work to alleviate the worst of it, but they don't prevent the headache, and that's the real breakthrough that psychedelics have, where people who in some cases, they take it like a week before or 3 days before, and then the cycle of headaches, they're called clusters because you get more than one in a day, and each one is 20 to 40 minutes.
Let me ask you something. Do you think if you microdosed with psilocybin daily, would it keep it away?
Well, I know of only one person who's microdosed, and that's with a different kind of headache called an ice pick headache.
Never heard
A
of that
cluster
one.
headache lasts 20 to 40 minutes. An ice pick headache, which is the same, but it lasts a minute. And I have seen someone alleviate that inside that minute with a microdose.
Really?
Now, they found, I think they took some larger doses and then prevented a whole series from occurring. So it's really, there's a lot of people who know a lot, but they are hardly publishing.
Right.
Yeah.
But they are writing to each other. And again, for anyone who's listening that knows anyone that has a cluster headache, please, please, please go to clusterbusters.com or .org and learn everything that they know.
Right. Please do.
Oh yeah, we need more people talking about this stuff. You know, both you and Albert Hoffman have called microdosing an under-researched area.
So I call it that because I'm quoting him.
What kind of work has been done in the past 5 years of microdoses?
In terms of like research that's published,
Yeah.
there's some anecdotal research or anecdotal stories in my book. That's it.
That's what you were saying.
And there are things around the web, but again, not much. And I'm actually collecting a lot of microdose stories, and I've asked people who are using it this way or want to. I send people a protocol, which is how to use it, say, over a month, and then ask them to report on what they're finding.
Wow.
And so there are now people who are exploring microdosing. That's a different word than researching it.
Mm-hmm.
And it is under research because just the way LSD already had a bad reputation in the legal world, on the scientific world, and then what came into vogue, really through originally psychedelic research. Psychedelics led us into this whole study of brain chemistry, which is not generally acknowledged, of course.
Right.
But things like Ritalin, which is early, and now things like Adderall, are a kind of inferior way of working with the mind, and microdosing looks like it's a better way. Since microdosing seems to make the entire system function better. Not wildly better, but just a little better in every way.
Right.
While the cognitive enhancers, and Adderall is the most best known, are basically amphetamine.
Of course.
And the amphetamine has a lot of side effects that are not good for you.
Wow, yeah. After doing, a lot of my own research, I microdosed with psilocybin to help me quit smoking cigarettes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and it absolutely worked. I've not smoked now since October last year, and I have no urge.
Okay.
Like you said, my ability to resist wasn't enhanced. The desire disappeared completely.
Well, there is now one study with a higher dose of psilocybin for people who were heavy smokers, the kind of 2-pack a day for 20 years people, who had tried all kinds of other things. And almost everyone in that study went into total remission. And what seemed to happen, and may have happened to you too, is it's like their body said, I'm going to raise my voice here. And no matter what you're getting out of cigarettes, I'm dying.
Right.
And you say to yourself, well, I know, I've heard that from my body all these years, but somehow there seems to be a shift on who's making the decisions.
Right.
So I'm going to ask you, I'll tell you how I work, okay? Your story actually means a lot to me. And I'm going to ask you after the program's over that you write me a note and tell me a little bit more about your smoking, your microdosing, your not smoking, because that's the kind of research that I use to move things forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually kept pretty detailed notes too. So
fantastic. Well,
I'll be sending them your way.
Now you have the perfect model of the way I do research, which is people tell me stuff and I say, "Can you write it down?" Or they write me stuff and I thank them.
Well, okay. There's currently no legislation to reschedule psychedelics.
No. What's happened in the kind of legal world is the drug reform people are very clear that marijuana is basically done. It's going to take a certain number of years, and there'll be 1 or 2 states that will hold out. But it's pretty clear that marijuana has passed that place where kind of hysterical lies are no longer being really. They're kind of gone out of fashion.
That's right.
Yeah, it's hard.
And Colorado has proved that everything that we people that said marijuana is helpful and healthy have proved to be true. Auto accidents are down. There's less teenage use. Arrests, by the way, are down 95%.
Wow.
And the difference between putting someone in prison and it costing $40,000 a year, or having them say, "I'd love to pay taxes."
Right.
It's really a huge shift, and states are beginning to get that if it isn't for medical and ethical reasons, it's just good business. Mm-hmm. And what the drug reform people are clear about is that kind of psychedelics are next.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because the research is that they have value. And that Schedule 1, there's a lot of drugs that are what are called Schedule 1. And Schedule 1 says this substance, not in our scientific opinion, but in our totally unscientific opinion, has no conceivable medical uses and a high possibility of addiction. Now, one of the things about psychedelics is they're anti-addictive. Now, that's curious because if you have a psychedelic on Monday and you have a fascinating, meaningful experience, you say, "Whoa, I want more of that." And you take the same dose on Tuesday, you'll have a very, very small effect. Mm-hmm. And if you take it on Wednesday, nothing happens. This is anti-addictive.
Right. So
clearly, psychedelics are more and more, as the research is coming in, are good for smoking cessation, are good for anxiety, excessive anxiety. MDMA is good for post-traumatic stress, and so forth and so on. So we're finding medical uses.
Right.
So you have now substances which are anti-addictive, have medical uses, and marijuana has kind of broken down the government's argument that just because it would like to put something on Schedule 1 doesn't mean that there's any scientific research to back that up.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so there is a shift coming because also those 24 million people, they go to graduate school, they become lawyers, they become scientists, they become FDA administrators. When you write a book, you become kind of like a call girl, which is you say, "Hello, total stranger, would you like to see my book?" And what I found when I was in that wonderful phase is that the number of people in professional positions who had some psychedelic experience, often in college, were very large. And those are the people who were running the culture. In the 60s, when people were using psychedelics, we were basically young and had no power in the establishment. And when we went to people in the establishment, they said, "I not only don't know what you're talking about, but I don't want to find out." You may remember that Galileo said to people, just look at the telescope and you look at the little moons around Jupiter. And they said, I don't want to do that.
No. Right.
Because I have a theology that says that isn't there.
Right.
And so we're those people, the equivalent of those people who we knew in the 60s, are really they're just dying out.
Good.
The old guard, right? It must
Yeah,
be...
they're the old guard, and the legislature, an awful lot of things go through Congress that nobody reads.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea, Schedule 1 is actually not through Congress, but once it existed, the federal government actually has things that are illegal which don't even exist, which is a remarkable feat of legislation. And what I mean is they say this substance is illegal, and substances kind of like it, known as analogs,
Right.
are also illegal, whether they exist or not. So as soon as they exist, they're illegal.
Wow.
For instance, there's a substance called 1P-LSD. It is legal in England until January. I'm sure it's illegal here. I haven't even checked, because as soon as it existed, it became illegal.
Right.
But England has a different system which says it has to exist. We have to look at it, and then we decide, and once a year we change our list of what's bad for you. So here's this substance, which, according to my friends in England, seems to be very, very much like LSD. And I'm not a biochemist, so I don't know what the 1P relates to. And they said it will be illegal in January. So,
Wow.
Right.
Get it while you can.
yeah. So that we're moving towards what I would call evidence-based legislation, but we're moving slowly.
Right.
I see what you mean.
Yeah, I think that is one of the biggest elephants in the room, is that you could go through years of conventional therapy, and then you could go through one high-dose session or a series of microdosing, and you could be cured of all these ailments that are affecting millions of people, PTSD.
Well, what we know is, and even I, as a kind of scientist, when say we're going to cure millions of people instantly, what we know is we have some really terrific tools. And that we do know how to use them. And the problem for the psychiatric and psychological world is you have to be trained in how to use them, and your basic training as a therapist may or may not be as helpful as you think. And so that's a different kind of resistance.
Right.
Just as a new medical procedure takes a long time to be accepted by the medical profession, even though it is evidently, and in their case, lots of research, that it's really better.
Right.
Now, it isn't as true in the pharmaceuticals, because a new pharmaceutical comes out with $50 to $100 million worth of advertising. So it's pushed by people who go into doctors' offices and say, I have a drug that's better than the one you're using.
Right.
And I'll take you to lunch.
Right.
Right. Of course, I'll buy this vacation.
Well, the graph that used to pervade the pharmaceutical industry is less. It is not none.
Right.
But in any case, there's a huge amount of advertising push for pharmaceuticals, and there isn't the same, let's say, for a better back operation.
Right.
It turns out that if people have back pain, they should go to a chiropractor.
Right.
As a first round. They should not go to a surgeon. But you don't find a lot of surgeons saying, no, I don't want to see you, just go to a chiropractor.
Right, of course not.
Because most surgeons don't know enough about chiropractic to really be helpful. So it's an information gap and a regulation gap.
Right. Do you think that Big Pharma has a big part in lobbying to keep the prohibition alive?
No, I don't think Big Pharma knows yet how inherently dangerous psychedelics are in terms of the one, PTSD is actually a good example, which is if you go to a VA hospital and you say, can I sit in on a group who have PTSD, you might meet a group of people who are Vietnam vets,
right,
who've been going to the VA and getting medicated for 30 years. Now, here's a study with MDMA that says if you give 2 to 3 doses, perhaps, of MDMA embedded in a therapeutic program, people will stop using medication.
Right.
That's when the pharmaceutical industry begins to understand that, then it will get very interesting.
Not looking forward to that.
Well, I think we all are, because we want things that help us, and we don't want things that only help us a little and have side effects.
You mentioned how they have a lot more advertising than psychedelics. How do you think psychedelics will be advertised?
Well, they'll be popularized, not advertised, because most psychedelics you can't make any money off them.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So, well, ketamine, for example, was, I think it was developed, maybe 1912. I'm trying to remember. Various drugs came out very early, so that the patents are all gone,
Mm-hmm.
so that anybody can make them. Now, there are some fairly intricate things, which is not our business, where the government will allow you to use a drug for a few years because you've developed all the information around it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that isn't what the pharmaceutical industry is interested in. So it's really a different era. It's a little bit like when antibiotics came in. Antibiotics cured stuff.
Right.
Now, there were things around to help people with diseases that we now know are caused by viruses or by bacteria, and we did whatever we could. But suddenly, antibiotics changed the game, which is you took one course of antibiotics and you were done.
Right.
So psychedelics are a little like that, perhaps, for a number of other conditions. But again, the difference is antibiotics set and setting is not important. Psychedelics are fundamentally based in mental set and setting, and the mental set of the sitter or the guide. They are very dose specific. They're a different class of materials, and we don't yet have a lot of we don't have much training in the medical schools.
Okay.
Let me give you one other example that one of the things that you wonder about is, why is American nutrition so lousy? Well, a lot of very expensive companies spend a lot to sell us food that isn't very healthy. And you think, well, why hasn't the medical profession been all over this for decades?
Right.
And only in recent years do medical schools have added a course in nutrition. So if you went to your doctor and you said something about nutrition, and he would honestly say, well, the government has this little triangle of foods you should eat, meaning I don't know anything more than you do. You think, well, why with all your training? The answer is because nobody gave courses in nutrition. And I asked the head of Prevention magazine once about that. And he said, in the history of medical curriculum, there was no point in asking for nutrition until there was basically freezers.
Right.
Because until you could store food, people would only eat what was local and in season.
Of course.
So in a sense, teaching about nutrition was kind of silly.
Right.
They also weren't eating a bunch of chemicals back then that would make up a Cheeto or something.
Right. So until we had preservatives, until we had a lot of ways of changing both the nature of food and the storage of food.
Okay.
So in the middle of winter, in Baltimore, I can go buy, a ripe melon.
Right.
Okay, so that's a total change.
Mm-hmm. So, James,
and again, government lobby and all those things that the liberals complain about are also true. That legislation drives commerce in ways that many of us are unaware of. But that's really getting far from the psychedelics.
Right. I wanted to talk about over the years, the people you've encountered, the experiences you've heard or witnessed. I want to know what the most remarkable 360 was, either with a problem solving or something profound or a change of heart. Or
I'd say that the problem solving is a good one, because when really Willis Harman, who was a full professor of electrical engineering at Stanford, but part of our core psychedelic research team in Menlo Park, he said, I think psychedelics could be used for hard-nosed science problems. And in general, if you looked at the evidence available then, this was in the 60s, there wasn't a shred of evidence that supported that. And we who'd been using these high doses for psychedelic experiences also knew that people on a reasonably high dose would look at their scientific problem, that they're, say, working at Hewlett-Packard, and they'd say, this is so trivial and so uninteresting compared to the cosmic music that I'm now tuned into. So there was really not a good reason to assume that this would work. And we did the study, and we had our first group of people, and we told them it was going to work. And we told them this would be a wonderful, positive experience, and they would be able to work on their scientific problems. And when they had done that, when they went home the first night, and we had them in groups of 4, we all danced around like little children because we said, God, it actually worked. Because what we found, and we had, the government stopped us they stopped all research at the same time, but we were stopped in the middle of that study. Mm-hmm. And what was fascinating as I look back on it and read the reports is almost nobody of that group of scientists, or about 28 of them, mm-hmm. did any personal work. Right. Or had any revelations of a mystical sort. They had somewhat visionary experiences as they were given a few quiet hours in the morning, mm-hmm. but they really all worked on their scientific problems. Right. And what we learned from that is that psychedelics, at least the classics, are capable of allowing you to focus directly in an area of interest. That you're not swept away. Again, dose is important, and let me be clear, because a lot of your listeners know about doses, that we were giving either 100 micrograms of LSD or 200 milligrams of mescaline, okay. Which is not an overwhelming dose. No. So that people stayed within their personality, within their bodies, within their scientific field of interest, right. and worked on those kinds of things.
Could you describe the dosage levels for people who don't know and
Sure.
when they're applicable?
Sure. Let's take LSD, which is the kind of gold standard. LSD is measured in micrograms. That's millionths of a gram. One of the interesting things about it's the most powerful psychological chemical ever discovered. Mm-hmm. Just in terms of how little goes so far. And if you are taking a dose in which you are interested in achieving this mystical experience, classical mystical experience, for most people, around 400 micrograms, 400 millionths of a gram, will, with a guide and with set and setting handled, will allow you, in many cases, to have such an experience. If you go down to 200 micrograms, which is half, that's a dose in which people can work very, very effectively with deep psychological issues. Because, again, you're staying within your identity. If you go down to 100 micrograms, which we were just talking about, scientific problem solving, that seems to be a very good area for that. 50 micrograms, and this is where I get a little historical, now it would be called a concert dose. In the 60s, it was called a museum dose, where you see how much more fancy we were. And then when you get down to the microdose, which is 10 micrograms, that's also called subperceptual, which means that nothing visual, the visual world has not changed. The walls don't move at all, and all the kind of psychedelic colors and so forth, none of that occurs. So it's really a very different substance. And what's interesting about what I just said, it's very few substances have totally different effects at different doses. Right. And if you think about it, if you take one aspirin, it has an effect. If you take 2, it has the same effect, a little more. Mm-hmm. If you take about 8, it's still the same effect. And when you get up to like 20, some of the side effects become very much more visible. Right. But it's basically the same thing. And in a sense, with psychedelic doses, it's like changing channels. Mm-hmm.
Can you
at different doses, and that's simply something again we haven't really focused on, but it's one of the remarkable things about these substances.
In a couple interviews, you mentioned garden neuroses. What level of taking psychedelics would affect those neuroses? Well,
there are 2 ways. One is this mid-range is 200 mm-hmm. with a therapist. None of these are done alone. Okay, with our scientists, we were on them to make sure that they stayed focused.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to stay focused. With the therapist, you're dealing with someone who says, "I'm a client, I want to help." And with the psychedelic experience, that was also therapeutic, but in a different way, which is after you realize that you are much more than yourself, then the neurotic issues of yourself become less important. It's a little bit as if I said, I'm so identified with my clothes, they're like me. And when I spill chocolate on my shirt, I'm ashamed because I then look like a person who has this body which has this terrible stain on it. And someone says, "It's just your shirt." And you say, "Oh, wow." And they say, "Here's another shirt." Wow. You say, "Oh." So it's like just my neuroses.
Right.
It's not that important. No. And as it becomes less important, it's also much easier to resolve. Huh. Wow. Now that's, as you said, garden level neuroses. When we get into very heavy trauma, it's different.
Right.
But one of the uses for LSD that was approved of in the 60s and became a standard treatment in one Canadian province, in Saskatchewan, was the use of LSD for hardcore long-term alcoholics. And they had about a 50% success rate, and they weren't yet using very good set and setting. Mm-hmm. So one of the questions is, why would a psychedelic allow you to stop being an alcoholic? Which is a little different than your experience with psilocybin and smoking.
Right.
And again, there is an alcohol study now being, I believe, done in New Mexico with LSD again, because there are a lot of alcoholics, and there doesn't have to be that many.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Jeez. It must be wonderful to see how much progress has been made in the wake of the psychedelic prohibition, for someone like you that's been studying this for 40 years.
You bet. Well, I used to complain about, government repression and all kinds of bad words. And then I think it was Charlie Grobe, who's one of the lovely researchers, and he said in a speech once, there was a 40-year lull in research. And I thought, what a kind and compassionate way of talking. Right. But there is that in the psychedelic world. One of the nice things about working in it is people are genuinely much nicer as a group. Mm-hmm. They are, because they're not all that fired up about their personalities.
Right.
And it is wonderful after these years to, I'm not sure how to handle it. I've been an outlaw for so long, so it's like getting out of prison, you don't know how to behave.
Yeah, right.
and I confess, after I had a heart infection, not all that serious, but enough. And I started using marijuana to go to sleep with. And I'm in California, and I have a marijuana card. And when I first got the card, it just felt strange. Right. That the normality of it felt strange.
Walking into a store, purchasing it.
Yeah, so that I'm now accepted in places that wouldn't have invited me before.
Right. And
that is interesting. And also, of course, since I think these are genuinely very beneficial for individuals and for a culture, it's wonderful.
Yeah, it seems to be a common theme in the psychedelic realm that people just want to help each other.
Well, partly because we are each other.
Right.
And since you know what I mean, that's obvious. But if you don't know what I mean, it's a rather strange concept. But it's a little bit as if you say, well, why you would help your brother and your sister because they're your family. And then you find out that your family is a little more, it's a little wider and more extensive than you thought.
True.
When I was reading the guide for how to be a guide in your book, one of the steps is to afterwards to give someone a flower, give the voyager a flower or something like from nature, and I assume that's to kind of drive home the point of we are all one.
No, actually, the flower that I recommend, because is what we learned is a rose just opening. And then if you begin to study the symbolism of the rose, or why it's so popular in so many religious traditions, and then you use one in the psychedelic session, you begin to understand that it is more powerful than other flowers. And the answer is, I don't know, I didn't invent the rose. But what happens, and it isn't about nature necessarily, what happens again from the high dose position, you come down and you are aware of your interconnectedness. And then if I hand someone this rosebud and they look at it and they hand it back, they say, that was just wonderful. I say, no, just look deeply into it. And they look into it, and then 40 minutes later they hand it back. Now, I don't know what goes on necessarily, but people indicate that was a very, very important experience for them. So that there are things in the culture or in the religious and mystical cultures which have been learned over the years by people working with altered states, and that we in the psychedelic world rediscovered them. I mean, for instance, what we learned, and it's now standard operating procedure, is to put headphones on someone and or earbuds and have them listen to music at first.
Right.
And I thought, we kind of invented that. But then you go to South America and you're in an ayahuasca setting, and there's the icados, or the songs, or the music. And then you go to Siberia and there's drumming, and then you find out that almost everywhere where there's been psychedelic use, there's also the use of music, or of rhythm, or of something that allows the mind not to be thinking about whether after psychedelics today I need to go to the grocery store and I need either to pick up salt butter or sweet butter, but to just go with the music, and you find that you're in another realm.
Right. So these common themes all throughout cultures.
Yeah, so we're relearning what the traditional people learned. And for at one point when I was starting to do my microdosing research, really based on the remarks of Hoffman, I talked to someone who was a really gifted anthropologist, and he said, "Did you ever think that the indigenous people would have tried microdosing?" And I thought, you've been working with these materials for a few thousand years. Would you have tried using a low dose? Oh, of course.
Right.
And then he said, for instance, when I'm about to get a cold, I take a microdose of mushroom.
Really?
And he said, I haven't had a cold in 10 years. So,
wow, I can believe it. Just forming a relationship with a plant like that can be so beneficial.
Yeah, that's another thing actually that people talk about. A woman I know who had taken ibogaine, and she had had a chronic sleep disorder. She hadn't had a good night's sleep since she was 9 years old, and she was close to 50.
Wow. And
she tried drugs, she tried hypnosis, she tried relaxation, she tried, hot baths, and she'd basically gone to sleep clinics. And she took ibogaine, which is a substance from the plant. The iboga plant comes from Africa. In a group with a very fine guide. And she said after the ibogaine session, I had the first good night's sleep since I was 9.
Oh, wow, that's incredible.
And this was now a year or two later, and I said, how do you sleep now? She says, if I'm alone, I just sleep wonderfully. If I'm with someone, then I probably need a little marijuana to go to sleep with.
Okay.
And then I learned that she was microdosing the ibogaine.
Really?
And I said, why are you doing that? She said, I want to keep a connection with the plant. So that's one reason. Right. Now, I also know people from an ibogaine clinic who say people find that it is useful to take a microdose of ibogaine after they've recovered from why they came to the clinic, which is ibogaine is usually hard drug addiction. So we're learning.
Right.
That's one drug I wouldn't have imagined you would want a microdose of.
I never thought of
out
that.
of everything else. Just that 24 to 48 hour experience of what I hear is not as pleasant. I wouldn't want to.
No, but the microdose, again, think of the LSD where I said it's sub-perceptual.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So the microdose is really a different order of experience. And I know another wonderful young woman, English woman, who's fortunately writing a wonderful memoir. And she took ibogaine, and I said, how'd that go for you? She said, well, I stopped taking cocaine on weekends. I stopped drinking alcohol. I stopped smoking, and I stopped eating junk food.
Wow.
We could all use some of that.
That's dangerous stuff.
Yeah, right. You know, I really like the idea of seeding transpersonal connectivity in different areas of study.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think if, for example, hypothetically, I was considering going to grad school, what do you think I should go for?
You should go and get some therapy first. Maybe you can recover from the idea. Since I founded a graduate I co-founded a graduate school of psychology. I can hardly say this is a bad idea. And the reason we founded, in this case, was called the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. It's been renamed recently Sophia University. Is we felt that conventional psychology missed a lot of what was important.
Right.
So we wanted people to be expert in a body discipline, like Aikido. We wanted them expert in meditation so they could teach it. We wanted them to be able to be good therapists, and we wanted them to have intellectual understanding. And we also wanted them to be creative. So we really had 5 areas. Okay. And it was a very intense, and it is a very intense program. And fortunately, our graduates are doing very well.
Awesome.
And we're now 30 plus years out, so we actually can tell. So there are, graduate school is a good idea if there's a place which will give you the education which you want.
Okay.
Right.
The other reason we're going to graduate school, it'll give you a degree which may allow you to do the kind of jobs you want.
Okay.
And so the person who is running the smoking cessation study at Johns Hopkins, one of the people involved is a man named Albert Garcia Romo. And Albert was a graduate student at our graduate school, and his training was good enough to get him a job at Hopkins. And that year we had another graduate who got a postdoc at Yale, working with salvia and with other substances. We haven't talked about salvia.
No.
And another person, Alicia Danforth, a wonderful person, who basically said, "I'm getting this degree so I can work with as a psychedelic therapist." And she's now doing breakthrough research with high-functioning autism people in Los Angeles at UCLA Harbor campus.
That's excellent.
So there are advantages to going to graduate school.
Right. Okay.
The disadvantage is many parts of graduate training, they won't know what I used to say they don't know what you're talking about. But I am on a list of graduate students to each other across institutions, and there's about 800 people on it, and the only way you get on this list is if you have overtly expressed your interest in psychedelics in a public way.
Mm-hmm.
Through a paper, through a presentation, through a publication, through kind of therapy, and they write each other about what schools are good and which faculty are open. And the answer is more and more.
Okay. Yeah, I know you mentioned that you actually went to grad school to avoid joining.
I went to graduate school because my alternative was to be drafted and to go to Vietnam.
Right.
And I was aware that I would be a terrible soldier, let alone after psychedelics, the idea of killing people just doesn't seem as good.
Yeah.
You're right. We always talk about if everybody in the world had taken psychedelics, there would definitely be no war.
Well, there would be certainly a different way of looking at a lot of these issues, right?
Yeah.
And when I say I didn't want to go to Vietnam, the idea of killing people, especially people I didn't even know.
Yeah.
And then to find out that, there wasn't there aren't a lot of good reasons for war, but it seems to be inordinately popular. And certainly we in the 60s felt that we would end war, and we have done a terrible job. That's one of our total failures.
Yeah.
But we did do much better with ecology and with the women's movement.
Right.
And a few other things that really we did start and did support.
Civil rights. Yeah. Man, who would you consider to be your mentor?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it's like I write, and I have writers who I admire, and I've had writing teachers, and I've done psychedelic therapy, and I have people who've helped me there. I once actually I thought about who am I most grateful to?
Okay.
And it got to be a really long list. And I thought, that's wonderful.
That is wonderful. Yeah, absolutely.
So that Willis Harman was really my mentor at Stanford, and Ram Dass gave me my first psychedelic. So I've been very fortunate.
I'm sorry for the psychedelic nerd or geek. That is an amazing statement. Ram Dass gave you your first psychedelic.
Well, he wasn't Ram Dass then. He was Richard Alpert, assistant professor of, and this was on his way to Paris, where he was then I was living in Paris, and he visited me. I'd been one of his favorite students. And he was then meeting up with Tim Leary and Aldous Huxley while we're name dropping. And they were going to present the first presentation about psychedelic research to an international conference of psychologists.
Wow, that's amazing.
That's incredible.
And he said to me, the greatest thing in the world has happened to me. And I thought, that's nice.
Right.
And he said, I want to share it with you. And I thought, well, that's good. And then he took some pills out of his jacket, and I thought, what the F is that?
Right.
Because I was so straight, I didn't drink coffee till I was around 50.
Wow.
Now, this was earlier. I did have psychedelics well before 50. And so he gave me some psilocybin and basically guided me and kind of opened up things. And I began to understand that there was a great deal that I had not only no understanding of, but no awareness that it even existed.
Jeez.
And so go ahead. Sorry.
There's a few movies out where it's in black and white, and then one character gets some kind of incredible insight or incredible something, and then they're in color.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That was the feeling.
So
that I'd been black and white all my life, and all of a sudden I found out, whoa, there's color.
Wow.
And the world is just much more interesting and much more complicated. And I think this is also generally true in the psychedelic community, more positive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Absolutely.
The world actually is for us.
Yes, right. Absolutely. So I have the last question I want to ask you is actually from Tom Robbins' book. The question is how do you make love stay? How
do you make love stay?
Yeah. How do you remain in an open learning state? Because with my psychedelic experiences, sometimes they're fleeting.
Right.
How do you make
one
that
is
stay?
Here's my image. There's a lot of people who want to get high, and you think of that like jumping to the top of the mountain. My goal is to raise the floor, so that when I come down from a high, I don't come down all the way.
Okay.
So that's my goal. So one of the things that's awkward when I'm with a lot of my younger friends, I have to kind of hide that I don't use psychedelics nearly as much as they do.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Because I'm really at a different place in terms of, that's my work. My work is to kind of raise the bottom. And that's one of the reasons that microdoses is interesting to me, because microdoses make you a little more, and then I can give you a long list of words, like a little kinder, a little more compassionate. You eat a little better. I have a number of people who say, after I was taking microdoses for a while, I went back to yoga, and then now I'm doing some meditation, and I notice, I'm ordering a salad and I want it.
Right.
So what they're seeing is a general kind of bettering of themselves.
Wow. I'm just realizing
that to me is really very exciting, and I'm remembering a big group of students that I asked a lot of questions of, and almost none of them had started taking psychedelics with anything interpersonal or spiritual or self-help in mind. But they gradually noticed that they were less neurotic, less shy, less angry, nicer to be around. They liked nature more, but it was quite gradual.
Right.
So it looks good.
I'm just realizing now, actually, that right after my microdosing experiment, I'm sure I'll tell you all about it, but I started doing yoga, I started eating. I did. I'm just realizing it now. It all sort of happened
Started
right at
eating
that
onions.
time. Yeah.
You started juicing.
Uh-huh.
Right.
Well, I hope you still eat gluten, though.
I do.
Well, Dr. Fadiman, we want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
It was an honor.
It really
is
was.
amazing.
I think what you're doing is so important to this community. It's so important to the world at large and to help millions of people, like you said, and I think it's totally possible in our lifetime, and you are a huge facilitator of this movement, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, and I want you to get that you guys, with your openness and this kind of program, remember a few years ago, you couldn't say to me, oh, yeah, when I did my such and such, my session. Right? So that the world is changing, and it's now considered acceptable to say, well, I've used psychedelics, like it's acceptable to say I went to college.
Right.
Or have a drink.
Right.
All right. to our mutual health.
Yes,
All right.
absolutely.
Thanks again, Dr. Fadiman.
Thank you. And hey, everybody.
Wasn't that amazing?
Seriously, Dr. James Fadiman, fucking Dr. James Fadiman. He is so influential to this community. It was such an honor to have him on.
Yeah, we're extremely grateful.
Extremely grateful to talk to someone like that. Go pick up the Psychedelic Explorers Guide.
Yeah.
Read it to your family.
Yeah.
Follow the steps. Do what you have to do because it'll make everyone's life that much better.
Go to psychedelicexplorersguide.com. Type it in on Google. It'll pop up. Type in James Fadiman. I think jamesfadiman.com is his website.
I think he also has Jim Fadiman, too. So
Yeah.
there's
Just
no going
Google.
wrong finding James Fadiman.
Google and also watch his YouTube lectures from maps, from interviews on TV. They're killer. He's a super cool guy to talk to and very knowledgeable.
Yeah. If you listen to our friend Lorenzo over at the Psychedelic Salon, I believe he's number 302 if you want to check him out back there from a couple years back.
Reading this book has made me feel like I don't know anything, and I thought I did. It's one of those aha moments where it's like, there's so much for me to learn.
Right.
I feel like I took a whole course on psychedelics after I read this book.
I think he definitely squashed our ego a little bit. You know, we've been talking to all these
Yeah.
people. We think we know so much about it, but in reality, we don't
No, not at all.
know that much.
No, each day
But
is
we're
a learning experience.
We're learning, and hopefully you guys are learning with us.
And let's just spread the knowledge and
Yeah.
make this stuff.
But for now, go to tinktinkclub.com. Leave us a message. Leave us a comment. Leave us a good rating on iTunes.
Yeah, tweet at us.
Yeah.
Post on our Instagram.
We
We'll
love
talk
hearing
back.
from you. We love it.
Facebook.
We
We've
love
been getting
you.
a bunch of Facebook messages.
Yes.
Keep doing it.
We're Tink Tink Club at everything,
Yeah.
and we're Tink Tink Club in your heart.
Thanks again for listening, guys. We love you.
Yes.
For the Tink Tink Club, I'm Matt Landis.
I'm Tim King.
And I'm Chris Conti.
We will tink you later.